Professor John Warhurst, thank you for joining us on Common Home TV today.
My pleasure. It's great to be here.
Well, first of all, can you start by telling us a little bit about your role in the plenary council leading up to and during the council?
Sure. Perhaps I'll work backwards. I'm a member of the plenary council, which means I've attended the two assemblies last October and just this week, which are the culmination of the plenary council. There's still implementation to come, of course. But going back 5 years, even before the plenary council was announced and got underway, our group, Concerned Catholics Canberra Goulburn, had taken the decision to firstly form and also to press for various renewals of the church. So the plenary council, following the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse in Australia, which can't be forgotten in the context of the plenary council. Then the plenary council is announced to do two things. One, to address the crisis in the church, or the various crises in the church, and secondly, to plan a way forward. And it was a 4-year process, beginning with broad consultation, in which we certainly played a part. 17,500 written submissions, over 200,000 participants in forming those written submissions. And then over the next 2 or 3 years, the process of putting together the composition of the plenary council, which is an official law-making body, played under Vatican rules. So it's not just a synod. It's something which is laid down with quite specific rules and regulations. So for the past 2.5 years, I've been a designated member, along with about 280 others, 45 bishops, and a cross-section of the church in Australia, but a distorted cross-section because the rules don't allow for full representation of the laity, for instance, and despite the best efforts of Australian leaders who got a little bit of change in the composition, still considerably underrepresented. But given that, a broad representation, we went through various stages, as you can imagine, of writing groups, frameworks, a document called the Instrumentum Laboris, which is basically a working document, eventually agendas, and we've had the first assembly, which was conducted online because COVID was still raging in Australia. That was last October, and now we've just finished a week of meetings in Sydney, which effectively brought the assembly and the plenary council to a conclusion, at least for the members. Of course, one of the final acts of the assembly was to set up an implementation process and an auditing process for what will be done, which will go on for the next decade. For those of us who are involved, that's a bit of a chilling prospect, because change in the church takes a long time, and you really have to buckle into almost several decades of engagement. So I think that's perhaps some background. I might go on to say that the agenda was broad-ranging. The timetable was very tight, but it ranged everything from Indigenous spirituality and engagement with the church's response to the child abuse crisis, how that is going, governance, of course, liturgy, the sacraments, women in the church, and many more. And women in the church came out to be one of the most controversial and liberating.
Can I jump in to ask you a little bit about that section 4?
Yeah.
It kind of made waves throughout the world, I think, in Catholic media. Can you tell us a little bit about it and who blocked the ratification?
Sure. I have to say just a little bit more about the rules before.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, I'll start with the fact that for political people, they may understand that it's effectively 2 houses of Congress or 2 houses of Parliament.
Sure.
So the general vote is everyone, and the second vote, which effectively ratifies the first vote, is conducted only by the bishops and the ordinaries. And that was about 45 members of the 280, including some Eastern Rite members, I must say, and that's an interesting complexity. But basically, the Australian bishops, all of them, diocesan bishops and archbishops, auxiliary bishops, and a few retired bishops. So you've got that situation. We come to women and the equal dignity of women and man, which is essentially a section to do with women in the church. Happy to discuss the content of that. It ranged widely, and perhaps the most controversial issue was the question of women's diaconate. Anyway, the part was worked through in the normal meeting procedures, a document, amendments. It was put to the vote. It was passed by a 2/3 majority. So the majorities have to be 2/3, and then went the next morning. So this happened on the Tuesday afternoon. The next morning, after overnight, it went to the bishops, and it failed to reach the 2/3 majority. I want to stress that the majority of bishops did vote for the document, but it fell short of a 2/3 majority. 25 or 27, I think, was the figure, and it needed to be 32. So we were stunned. It wasn't as if this issue was unforeseen. In fact, I'd been having discussions, and so had others, with the bishops about what might happen if this occurred, because we knew it wouldn't go down well, to put it mildly. But anyway, this happened. We then went off to morning tea almost immediately afterwards, and when the murmurings and the incomprehension among the lay delegates, particularly the women, was such that at the end of the morning tea break, about 60 women and their supporters among the members decided not to rejoin the meeting, to make a silent stand that this couldn't be business as usual. We couldn't just go on with the next item of business and forget this had happened. And the impact was quite remarkable, and to give the authorities credit, they scrambled to catch up. This took some time. The bishops met in an emergency session over lunch. The next little time before lunch had been taken up with general discussion. The bishops met, and the members who wished to, the 60 and I think a few others, and some members of the Pariti, the advisors, met over lunch as well. We came back, and effectively standing orders were put to one side. There were reports back. The president of the plenary council, Archbishop Costello of Perth, who'd actually been ill and was not present in the morning, came back to the meeting and made quite an impassioned speech. The actual chair, the vice president, Shane McKinlay, a regional bishop from Victoria, announced that we would be reconsidering. And there were also reports to tell the rest of the assembly just how hurt and absolutely disenchanted those of us who were involved were with the proceedings, and to give credit to the organisers. Over the next little bit, we spent the rest of the day just in discussion. We only had 5 days of business days, and yet we effectively took one day to try and resolve this issue. Eventually, the motions were rescinded. They were, which is pretty unheard of, and new motions were drafted to give the Assembly the power to reconsider the question again. A 4-person working group was worked overnight to put together a reshaping. It couldn't be a dilution, but it had to be a reshaping of the original document. I must say, one of the real weaknesses of the process, which hasn't been resolved, was that we never heard back from the dissenting bishops about why they had not accepted.
Well, that leads into actually a question I had. The dissenting bishops, were they named Was this
No,
something
they
that
were
was transparent? Do we know who said? And also, thank you for clarifying the majority of bishops, because I think when people hear this, they probably automatically thought it was 50+1, but the majority of bishops voted against. That's great. But
Yeah.
where's the transparency on the bishops?
Well, there's no no transparency at all. And of course, that's been one of the issues of the renewal movement. So here we had a case study within the assembly of a total lack of transparency. And even after the bishops had met, they refused, well, they felt they couldn't deal with this issue of lack of transparency, and that they had to respect the privacy of the dissenting bishops. Now, what we know is that two bishops actually stood with the women at the side of the room to give them enormous credit. We know who they are, and wonderful men, but we don't know. And the chair, when these questions were asked, said, "Well, look, we're respecting the privacy of the bishops, and we've taken advice from canon lawyers that that this is the situation. You don't respond. You're not called to explain." Well, that's not good enough, I'm afraid. The wider community and the wider world, and most of the members of the assembly, because all of the subsequent work was done without really knowing what the objection may have been to the original document. We assume that the step towards the women's diaconate, which was a mild motion, which just said, if the Vatican exceeds and introduces the women's diaconate, then the Australian Church will move in that direction. It was a statement of support, but it was not really a strong statement, as some of us had wished, that the Australian Church calls for the diaconate for women. It was really a somewhat milder state. So it was assumed that may have been the sticking point. There may have been other sticking points, but it really showed a dysfunction of process. Yeah. And we hope that it wasn't resolved during the assembly. Of course, there were conversations at table groups. I should say that audience may be interested to know that we were in 30 tables of about 9 people per table. So there was a lot of face-to-face, and there's a lot of, I had 2 bishops in my small table, and so did others, of course, and it trickled back that most of the bishops were stunned. The bishops who voted to accept the women's document, the Women in the Church document, I think they were as stunned as the rest of us. And some of them, I think, angry, blindsided by their colleagues. And I don't know how these things play out within the bishops' conference, but one would assume, and the bishops have now gone away on retreat for a few days to digest the plenary council, one would hope and assume that there's straight talking about transparency and about dealing with procedures which inhibit transparency. Some felt that even given all of the procedures, that it would have been a wonderful gesture if 1 or 2 bishops had come up to the front microphone and said, look, yeah, okay, I was one of those bishops who voted no. Another point of detail, there's too many points of detail, but you can actually vote 3 ways: yes, no, or yes with reservations. And yes with reservations is counted as a no. So some of those dissenting votes were actually not absolute no's, but they effectively
a call for clarification.
Call for clarification.
I think that it sort of blows up what you were saying. I understand why you made the reference, but like the Westminster system of the upper and lower house, with my silly accent, I'm from Canada. It might be a shock to some people listening that Canada has a Senate that's unelected. But that being said, when they put a vote, it's not behind closed doors, right? Like there's a transparency there that is totally lacking. And I know that we're putting our best foot forward because we will get to hopefully to a lot of the positives, because there is a lot of positives to be said about the steps, directions, and whatnot. But it is with that being said, that we need to address that transparency in media as well. I haven't heard much Catholic media speak about this transparency issue. Following at arm's length, most of everything seems very positive, and that's great. But where is the Catholic media that is self-critiquing? It's easy for secular media to critique, and it's easy for some reactionaries to say, oh, they're just secular, they're anti-Catholic, and that can be eschewed. But should there not be a role for Catholic media to also be promoting this transparency in a more vocal way?
Oh, absolutely, and that's not happening at the moment. And I think Catholic media is suffering because of it, in that many Catholics were just not reading Catholic media. But even so, given that, the Catholic media, there's different parts, of course, but the diocesan Catholic media are very much beholden, and in fact, they are creatures of the diocesan authorities, and generally are not. You don't see any self-critique within their pages. I mean, some of the diocesan Catholic media even go much further than that. You would argue that they are proponents of a very conservative view of internal church operations and church reform. There is other Catholic media that perhaps don't, who are really just repeating the media releases of the authorities. And the plenary council's communication professionals did pump out an awful lot of material, and they did conduct sometimes podcasts and other things which gave a range of views. But the official media releases, which came out at the end of each day, tended to be pretty anodyne. You'd sort of get a sense of the business, but I don't think they really picked up on important issues like this. I mean, I'd like to mention Father Frank Brennan, a Jesuit who is well known in Australia for a public voice. He is one who, since Wednesday, has been calling out through his various outlets, and he has access to the secular media as well as his own outlets. And he has been calling attention to the travesty of no transparency on the Wednesday, and also to the link to the general problem of transparency. Now, there is a small mention in this part on governance that transparency and synodality are really very closely linked. And if we're going to take synodality seriously, then it has to be an open dialogue, and you can't have a dialogue in which a lot of things are going on behind closed doors within the chancelleries and among the bishops and the bishops' conferences, and the rest of the Catholic community, the laity in particular, are asked to just get on with it. I mean, that won't do. And I mean, governments are not as transparent as they should be sometimes, but they do at least are called to account.
There's an accountability, and the lack of the lack of accountability only expedites your demise, right? Like, I think that being a cheerleader constantly in media is only speeds up the rate in which, you must have seen that the recent census, the rise of the no believers, and we just feed our own problem by not having the courage to address. You spoke about those little table meetings. That's where all the genius comes from. I've been part of Catholic media in Australia for years now, and there is the people know in these little roundtables they're saying what needs to be said, but when it comes to actually putting it out, it really goes back to cheerleading. And I think I personally think we're seeing a lot of that now. There's a lot of positive, which I promise we'll get to.
Yeah, sure.
But with that being said, there's no use taking that. It shows that you're not taking synodality seriously, as you said, if you can't find accountability. I think that with the Royal Commission, you see the need for accountability. In the Royal Commission as well, we speak of clericalism. Was that addressed in any meaningful way? Did anybody speak on the topic? Was that addressed? And of course, when we speak about clericalism, just as a caveat, it's not to disparage anybody's vocation to the priesthood or to priests themselves or the good priests have done. But clericalism is a very specific thing. So if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
Sure. Yes, it was spoken about, and it was also spoken against. So to put the context, I don't think Pope Francis's anti-clericalism and his quite potent language about the evils of clericalism, I wouldn't say they were reflected strongly enough within the Australian plenary council, but they were reflected. And there is a part of the church which says, oh, you can't talk about clericalism in the presence of clerics, because they would then see this as a personal criticism. Well, of course, it's got nothing to do with personal criticism.
Of course,
it's got nothing to do with appreciation of the priests and bishops in our midst. We put our personal friendships and appreciation aside. That's taken for granted, and I think there still is a defensiveness, and this has come through in not just the assemblies, but in other discussions within the plenary council process. Some bishops are very sensitive to any suggestions that it's us and them, and that they should be, and some priests too. And yet that's not what it's all about. And what we saw running through the discussions about co-responsibility and the need for transparency and mechanisms of synodality, new mechanisms and enforcement of old mechanisms like diocesan pastoral councils and breathing new life into parish pastoral councils. All of this is done.
We'd also have to admit that these things do exist. There is a dichotomy in certain aspects. It's my sacrifice and yours now. Like, there is some people hearkening back to saying we've gone too far.
Sure.
And within that, how do we, I don't want to say push back, because again, the idea is to get on the same page, to speak things through in the synodal way. And I really believe in that. I think that this is actually a stunning, as an outsider not being there, the way that type of volatility was handled, I thought was beautiful.
Yeah, I agree. We haven't got to the stage of transforming the church by any means, and no one would be, their expectations are not that high. And one of the problems is that the old practices, even the liturgical practices, are grafted onto new practices. So, for instance, I commented in a blog that I wrote that even the opening mass was an exercise in segmentation. So you have the bishops and the priests concelebrating, and you have the laity sort of sitting among themselves as if they were separate. And some priests actually stood with the laity and said, look, in the interest of synodality on this particular occasion, I'm going to mix in with the laity in our Eucharistic celebration. And I think that's a wonderful image. Even at the closing mass, which was a 2-hour solemn high mass, beautiful in many ways, beautiful music, beautiful words. There's still this sense of, can't we do things a little bit differently, where we're all, we're all in our rows, and it emphasizes a separation, a clericalism in the liturgical sense. And I just think that takes away from then going on to a meeting where we all sit around a round table. You're sort of making a statement that we're all different. And it's hard to avoid, some people would argue with me about this, it's hard to avoid a sense of, well, the clerics among us are just a little bit superior or a lot superior, and have this special place. Now, we can argue about special places, but I think we should do all we can to break down divisions between laity, clergy, religious, bishops. And I think most people are happy to do that. We even had a couple of bishops who joined the laity in the masses, and felt that the optics, to use that term,
I think there's
are very important.
They are.
Yeah, when we see that with Rome too, don't we? When we see synods of bishops, it sends entirely the wrong message when you've got 400 bishops and cardinals in their ceremonial robes, and a couple of religious sisters in the back row. I mean, you can't brush that aside. And so that aspect, the liturgy, by the way, was generally beautiful, and it was encompassed by the indigenous welcomes to country and acknowledgement of country and beautiful liturgy. It was a very spiritual occasion. That's the other thing. It's not just, saying a few prayers at the beginning of the day. This prayerfulness runs right through the spiritual conversations frame the tough talk, if you like, and the business of the meeting, and that's wonderful. And we're edging, and sometimes I think we're taking big steps. Sometimes I think there's just baby steps at the moment in some ways, but we're moving in the right direction.
Well, that's a great positive note to end on. I'll ask you one last question because we have about 5 minutes to wrap up. What are the next steps, and how do you see this playing out? I guess Germany is having what they could learn from us. What can we do to support these baby steps becoming, the Catholic Church is a massive boat. And I think, to be fair, when you make big turns with that can really capsize. But there is, with this, there is positivity to be taken away. So how do we continue this?
Well, I think in two ways. One, internationally, I think the approach has to be, let the voices of the national churches be heard. And we were very encouraged by developments in the Amazon, in Germany, in what we knew of synodal developments elsewhere. Let the international church, huge as it is, let those in the Pope Francis and others in ultimate authority hear our voices. Secondly, and pick up on issues that we've raised, because we were picking up on issues that others have raised. Secondly, there is a new synodal body being put into practice. One of our recommendations was that sitting alongside the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference would be a new multi-representative synodal national round table, still in its infancy, but that's a positive step. And that body will be reviewing the implementation of all we've done over the next decade. So, because one of the factors, of course, is that the diocesan bishops are still central to the process, and no one is doubting that they perhaps should be, but that the reality is they are. And the response in Australia will be a patchwork one. It won't be a national response. Parishes will be empowered. Some dioceses will be empowered. The future will come at a different pace from depending where you find yourself in the church. Networks have been built, and all of us are looking forward to exercising our voices and our networks and learning from one another over the next 10 years.
Well, John, we thank you again for joining us. And if you just want to plug again how people will get in contact with Concerned Catholics.
Well, I'll just say go. We have a website, of course. During the plenary, we ran a nightly news service called Plenary Tracker, run by Concerned Catholics Canberra Goulburn. There you will find a report on each day's events, together with blogs and a number of podcasts. And I think that would be the best way into those who want to understand for their own purposes how the church in Australia, particularly those seeking renewal, where the Plenary Council fits in to where we're going.
Well, again, thank you. And we hope this isn't the last time. We hope we can call on you again for your expertise.
That'd be wonderful, Matt. Thank you for the opportunity.
Cheers.